Hello and welcome to the Rask Network. What you're about to hear and see is limited to general financial information only. Please be sure to speak to your financial planner or refer to our financial services guide available at rask.com.au/FSG before acting on the information.
Have you ever imagined getting to a point where you don't have to work, but you choose to? Or you're able to work part-time without worrying about the loss of income? Or you're able to take time off to spend with your new family without having to worry about going back to work as soon as your paid parental leave runs out? Us too. Today, we're going to cover what dividends are, what type of investments pay dividends, how do you invest in them, how do you build an income-producing portfolio, and how much you actually need. And it might be a little bit less or more than you thought. Sounds interesting? Let's jump in. Hello and welcome back to the Australian Finance Podcast. I'm your host, Kate Campbell, and I'm here today with my wonderful co-host, Owen Rask.
I'll take wonderful, Kate. It's great to be here.
Yes, it is wonderful.
Yes, and we're going to be talking about having enough money and using your money responsibly so that you can earn passive income, which is probably what 99% of us want when we think about living our best life.
Yes, and neither of us are here to sell you any courses or anything like that. We do have a lot of free courses on investing in ETFs, but that's another story. We aren't living off dividends completely ourselves. We're in the process of building our own investment portfolio. We're in the process of building wealth, but we've both invested in some things that have paid dividends. I've received a $50 or $100 here and there throughout the years that I've been able to go, oh, this is really cool. I get to see what this investment's doing. I get to receive some income. I can choose to reinvest it. I can choose to spend it on a coffee. I can choose to go out to the movies with it.
And have fun.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Live your life. And a lot of people experience that for the first time when they get a dividend, which we'll explain in this show. But it's like you roll over and you wake up and all of a sudden you see a buzz on your phone and there's a dividend that's hit your bank account. And it seems like magic. The first few times you see that, obviously you and I have experienced it for a few years now, but that is truly magic to roll over and see more money to your name. And we'll explain how that happens and why that happens in this episode. And I think it's really important to understand that if you're new here, we're going to cover a lot of the essential topics, but we have other resources that you can dive into to get a little bit more granularity on the individual areas that are taking your fancy.
Absolutely. So I do want to get into all the nitty-gritty details. So if you're listening right now and you don't know what a share is, what a dividend is, all of that stuff, we're going to cover that. But Owen, is it actually possible to build an investment portfolio where you can just wake up every day and you've got dividends rolling in that are going to cover all of your living expenses?
Absolutely it is, Kate. A lot of our community and a lot of people that watch this show are already retired. And if you think about it from an Australian's perspective, every week and every month, your employer is putting 10% of your wage into a superannuation fund. And if you think about that, what's that designed to do? When you retire, you're going to live off that money. And that is producing income. And all of those people that you see walking around the street that are retired, those people are relying on the income that comes from their investments. It's made over a lifetime. And that's why I think superannuation is a wonderful thing, because it forces us to invest, even if we don't understand what it actually does.
And even if we don't want to think about future us.
Exactly. But you don't need to just rely on superannuation. There are many different ways to invest, and many people retire early and rely on their passive income. So income that they don't have to actively work a job to receive or actively go out and do something. It's passive, meaning that it just appears in your bank account like magic. And that's what we're focusing on today. And absolutely, that is possible.
Yeah. Are you able to share an example? Because I think sometimes when you see the words passive income or dividend investing on YouTube, it sounds like it just kind of can happen without doing any work. And it can feel sometimes a little bit scammy, which we know it isn't.
Yeah. So a lot of people might be familiar with say e-commerce. If they have a website and they sell like a t-shirt, typically you can design a t-shirt, put on your website and it's sold and then the money kind of appears in your bank account, right? It's like a very common thing that you see with people trying to do and talk about like on YouTube and places like this. Really what we're talking about is something different. We're talking about a similar concept, except you don't run the business. You just invest in something. So let's say, for example, you use Apple as your iPhone. Someone had to make that, right? But if you own shares in Apple, you didn't make Apple. You didn't make the iPhone, but you're benefiting as a shareholder. So that's a really common example. Another one is if you own an investment property, you effectively receive the rental income that someone else is paying you to live in your property. A bank account, really simple example. You've got money in the bank. You get interest on that money. You might get 3 or 4% a year. That's going to automatically be added to your bank account automatically. You don't have to do anything for it. So those are the 3 most common examples, and they all have pros and cons, but you can see it's not really scammy. The ones where people get scammed are when they have really unrealistic expectations. So promises of 10% per year, or, a really quick return in the next few months. That is a red flag. Be very concerned if you hear that. But for the most part, if you're earning, a respectable, decent income, which we're going to talk about, you can let that snowball over a long period of time.
So there's a range of different things we can invest in to get a passive income, and some require a bit more work. Maybe if you have an investment property, you actually need to do some work. You need to change the dishwasher when it breaks down. You need to fix the lights. But you can also invest in shares and ETFs. And that's really what we want to focus on today. So before we jump into explaining what dividends are you able to give us a 101 on what a share is for anyone that's unfamiliar?
Sure. So a share is part ownership of a business. So sometimes if you're new to investing, you get confused by 3 different ways that we describe it. Some people say shares. That's what we say in Australia. Some people say stocks. That's what they say in the United States. And some people say equities.
If they're fancy.
If they're fancy. All 3 of them, exactly the same. But what do they actually represent? Let's say, going back to the Apple example. I'm using Apple.
We've got the phone right there. We've got the laptop.
We've both got laptops in front of us. These are all Apple devices. Someone owns Apple, right? And that someone is probably you through your superannuation fund. But you can open an account. It kind of looks like a bank account if you're new to it, or like Amazon, where you go on, it's called a brokerage account, and you shop for shares to buy. And this is how you access the stock market. And so really, realistically, all you're doing is you're looking through the stock market to find businesses that you can have a tiny, tiny, tiny little piece in. And then you'll get income and growth as a part of that. And so when we talk about shares, it's important to understand we're talking about part ownership of businesses. What we're not talking about is what the finance industry and people on social media or people with big fancy suits will want you to believe, which is that the share market is like gambling and you need to pay them money in order to get their secret strategy or their trading tools. That stuff doesn't work. What works is remembering that the share market is where you own businesses. So you buy a business and you hold on to the shares.
Now that we know what a share is and we can understand it just by thinking about the laptop in front of us and going, I own part of Apple, a very, very tiny part given how large it is and the fact that we are not billionaires, but I own part of Apple. And if Apple does well, I get to benefit by being a shareholder. What is a dividend?
So a dividend is just like, think about it like interest on your bank account, like the bank promises you to pay a bit of money. So it might be like 3 or 4%. A dividend is just your share of the company's profits. So we know that Apple's a really big company, you just mentioned. We've bought all of this stuff on the table in front of us. Now, I can tell you with certainty that even a few years after listening to this podcast, Apple will still be making profits. And so when it makes a profit, what happens is each and every year, the board of directors sits down and goes, oh, we've sold a few iPhones this year. We've done pretty well with our MacBooks. What we're going to do is we've got this cash that we've collected from selling all this stuff. We're going to send some of that back to the people that own this company. And that would be like you and I, might be like your superannuation fund or pension fund. It might be an investment company. It could be anything. Anyone that owns part of Apple will get some of that income back to them. This is a really important concept to understand because dividends are really the best form of passive income anywhere in the world. So yeah, some people might have, different sources of income, but ultimately dividends from companies that you own via the share market are the best source of passive income.
Are you able to share an example of maybe even just use the coffee shop example, which we have in the past, where maybe there's 1 or 2 shareholders and they pay a dividend? What would that look like?
Sure. So that's a really good example. So imagine your local coffee shop. You go down, you order your soy cappuccino or whatever you might order, and you pay money and you see other customers are there and the business looks like it's doing pretty well. At the end of the day, you tally up all the profit, all the costs to serve that coffee, as well as what your takings are. And you might be left with a profit, right? Now, if you are the business owner and you own that cafe, you could choose to pay all of that money that's left over as a dividend, in which case you would receive all of that money from the profits effectively, right? Now, imagine you have a business partner and you're 50-50 in that business together. Now you're only getting half of the profits, right? But now let's imagine instead of a local coffee shop, it's a gigantic company like Telstra, one of Australia's biggest telecommunications companies. Now you're sharing the profits with 1 million other shareholders, right? So instead of getting maybe $500 for the day in takings, you're getting 20 cents per share, or maybe you're getting $50 overall for the year. And that is ultimately what the share market does. It takes these big companies, breaks it down into little shares for individual investors like us. And ultimately, it comes back to that idea, you're buying a business, whether it's a cafe, Apple, Telstra, doesn't matter. That's why the share market exists.
Do companies have to pay dividends?
No, they do not. That's another misconception. Even the biggest companies do not have to pay dividends. And there are some other rules around this, particularly here in Australia, where companies are inclined to pay more dividends. So if you were to compare the Australian share market to the United States share market, the biggest one in the world, what you will find is that the United States share market has tended to grow faster, whereas the Australian share market pays more in dividends. And that's because in Australia, companies have a legislative, or there's a reason why they would pay more dividends, because there's not as much tax. In the United States, if you pay a dividend, you pay extra tax effectively compared to Australia. So what we find is that Australian companies have better dividend income. US companies have better growth potential. And that's a broad generalization. There are a lot of companies on both of those stock markets, but that's the general gist. They do not have to pay a dividend, but in Australia, they're more inclined to do that.
If I invested in a large Australian company, you mentioned Telstra, maybe Commonwealth Bank, maybe BHP, and they pay a dividend, how often or when does that happen?
It typically happens every 6 months. So typically in Australia, companies will meet, they'll do their half-year financial report, they'll tally up all of the costs and all of the income that they've generated, and they'll determine a profit. They report that back to you as a shareholder. Then they'll say, we're going to pay a dividend of, let's say it's 50 cents a share. If you own 5 shares, you're getting 5 multiplied by 50 cents, $2.50. I know that doesn't sound like much, but typically you'd own more than 5 shares. But that's what happens. Now the company comes out and they say, we made this much profit and we're going to give you this much in dividends. Typically that dividend doesn't come to you straight away. It's typically a few weeks later. And that's important to understand because you need to make sure that you own those shares that on a particular day before the dividend is considered paid. And there's some fancy terminology around that, but all you need to know, if you're a long-term shareholder, you're going to continuously receive the dividends to your bank account. If you try and buy and sell shares really quickly, like some people do, you may actually miss out because you may not hold it at the specific time that they record the dividend to those shareholders. So it's really important that you do continue to hold the shares through that period so you can actually receive the dividend.
And it might be worth mentioning there's something else in Australia called a dividend reinvestment plan.
Yeah. So in the United States, they call these DRIPs. So dividend reinvestment plans, DRP, DRIP. Remember that. And basically what this means is if you don't need the income, if you don't want that passive income when you roll over and you wake up, what you want to make sure is that you have the DRP set up. You can go and do that through something called a share registry, and we have separate guides and videos and podcasts on that. But basically what this is an automatic reinvestment. So instead of taking your $2.50 as a dividend, you might have that $2.50 reinvested into another share, and that share automatically appears in your bank account. A lot of people love to do this early in their life. The reason is that they can effectively compound their money. They don't need to worry about which share they're going to buy or which ETF they're going to buy. It just automatically repurchases more of that one. And I've seen people, Kate, that have left this on and they didn't realize. And then 20 years later, they've got so much more money because they didn't get paid a dividend. They've forgotten about it. And it just kept reinvesting and reinvesting and reinvesting and reinvesting. And they've got this big pile of money at the end, which is a fantastic thought. But not everyone needs it because some people do want the cash, but some people do want it reinvested.
All right. So now we know some of the basics about what dividends are. Are we able to talk about the pros and cons of investing in a company or an ETF that pays a dividend?
Yeah, sure. So as you said before, dividends are not guaranteed. So not every company pays them. Here in Australia, we tend to have more companies paying dividends. But you got to remember, if we go back to our cafe example, right? Imagine that you own the local cafe and you've got all of the sales from that day, and then you've paid for all of the coffee beans and the milk. And then you're like, I've got $500 left over in my business. I'm going to pay that all as a dividend. When you come back to the cafe the next morning, you might find that you don't have any milk and you don't have any coffee beans and you can't sell a coffee. So the key thing is that some companies keep that money and they reinvest it for the next day's growth and for the next year's growth, right? So they want to keep some of that profits for the future growth. What can happen is if you only target companies that pay dividends, your investment might not grow fast enough. So it's great to have the income now, but ultimately we want it to keep growing. So that's one of the key things that I think distinguish kind of beginner investors from the next level investors, which is that they tend to focus only on the income and forget that the company needs to keep growing. Another thing that's really important to understand is you'll pay tax. If you receive a dividend, you do need to pay tax, and you do need to disclose that to the ATO, the Australian Tax Office here in Australia. And if you fill in your tax file number when you set up your brokerage account, typically that's pre-filled, so it may be sent to the ATO on your behalf. So it's really important you keep good records, and there are ways that you can do that with software and so forth. Another thing is that you've got to remember that investing in the share market can seem really risky. The longer you focus on, the smoother the journey becomes. But if you zoomed into any one day or any 1 week or any 1 year, the stock market doesn't go straight up. So dividend investing in particular isn't like a bank account. In Australia, provided you have the right bank, your money is effectively guaranteed. But when you invest in the share market, there are no guarantees. And anyone that makes you think that way is probably selling you a lie.
So you're not putting your house deposit in a company just because it's going to pay a dividend?
Absolutely not. So a common mistake is someone puts their money into an investment like a share, and then they think, I'm going to get the next dividend. But then in the meantime, the share price falls. So there's no point getting the dividend because the shares have fallen. So when you go to sell, it kind of neutralizes itself. And so what you want to make sure is that you're investing for the long term and you're investing in stable investments that will continue to grow over time with that really long-term horizon. I just want to mention that again. It's really important. But if you do it all right, you can get stable income. Even though you may pay tax, there's a beautiful thing in Australia called franking credits, which are a tax credit. So they're a tax advantage for you. And ultimately, you don't need to worry about tenants if you have an investment property. You don't need to worry about getting up every morning and going to work. It's all happening in the background automatically for you. So those are some of the reasons why you would use dividend investing as part of that passive income, and as well some of the ways that people go wrong with it.
What might be a reason you don't want to invest in a dividend-focused share or ETF?
It's because you want the long-term growth. So probably the number one reason that you don't want to just rely on dividends is you do want some of the growth that comes with it. Now, I want to be really careful here, Kate, because some people make you believe that you can't have one without the other, or they're separate things. You can have both, but sometimes companies are better for dividends and sometimes they're better for growth. So there's no one right rule that governs them all. But I'll give you a good example. In Australia, we have a company called ARB Corp. ARB is a company that makes bull bars and accessories for 4x4s.
Really exciting stuff.
Really exciting stuff. But Australians, we love the outdoors and we love driving our Hiluxes or our Ford Rangers, or tradies need them as part of their job, right? So you can own part of the company that puts the bull bars, maybe puts the lights on, maybe it helps them in other ways too. That company has done an exceptional job of growing its profits and paying dividends over time. So that's one of these beautiful companies, like it's Nirvana, investing Nirvana, where it goes up and it pays income. And if you think about a property, Kate, it's kind of the same thing. If you own a property in Australia, what you're hoping for is if you're renting it out, you get some income, but also the property goes up in value. And so shares do that too. And I would argue they do it better than property too.
All right, Owen, we have set the stage for income producing investments and what that could look like. How do we start investing in these and building this sweet passive income portfolio?
So this is the obvious next step, how to do the thing. The good news is in Australia, you only need about $5 to get started. Whereas in 10 or 20 years ago, you would have needed at least $500 to get started. So what you need is a way that you can take money that's in your bank account and purchase the investments. In Australia, we call that a brokerage account. So this is an online account that you create, that you put your money into, and then you buy and hold the investments. There are multiple ways to go about this. We call them brokers for short, but there are two different and distinct ones that you can choose. One is a micro investing platform. We have an episode on that. Another one is what most of us use, which is a brokerage account. So there are many examples here in Australia, but a micro investing platform, basically all that means, it's the same thing as a brokerage account. You can just do it with $5 instead of 500 at a time. And what we do is we go into this account and we find the investments that we want. So we might want some Australian investments and we go in there and we click buy. And that's literally what happens. And then we wait for 6 months and get that dividend, or we wait a few months and then it keeps growing and growing and growing. And that's effectively what a brokerage account is. What you do within that brokerage account is probably the more important thing.
So we talked about investing in shares, stocks, equities, all of those different names earlier in the episode, whether that's Apple or Telstra or Commonwealth Bank. There's something else that I think we should introduce listeners to called an exchange traded fund.
Often confused for EFT, what we're talking about is ETF, exchange traded fund. What this is imagine you and I both want to invest in Telstra shares, Kate. Now, normally you and I would both need to go and find the individual investment and click buy in our brokerage account and hold the shares. In ETF, what it does is effectively enables everyone to pull their money together and buy multiple investments in one go. So you and I might both own the same ETF. Let's say there's one that just invests in Australia and we get everything in one go. So a good example of this, or a good analogy, I should say, is imagine you're buying a box of favorites. I know Molly Benjamin from Ladies Finance Club talks about this analogy as well. In a box of favorites, you might have some cherry ripe, you might have some dairy milk, you might have some Turkish delight. Some of those things you like, some of them you don't, but you know that you've got a bit of everything. What we're trying to do in this example is we're not buying the individual chocolates or the individual shares. We're buying the box. So we buy an ETF, which is like this box, and we can invest one amount and we get a little bit of all of those different chocolates that are at it. That is effectively what an ETF is. And they've been around for decades. Some people think that these are relatively new, but they're not. It's like share markets have been around for 400 years. These have been around for, say, 20 or 30 years. But in Australia, it's estimated over 2 million people have invested in ETFs. So this is a big and important and growing part of the way people invest. And basically what it means for you and I, Kate, is we don't need to pick which individual investments. We don't need to pick Apple. We don't need to pick Telstra. We don't need to pick BHP. We can just pick an ETF and it owns all of them in one go. And that means that we're not exposing ourselves to trying to be the next Warren Buffett or something like this. We literally just own all of it in one go.
Yeah. And we did a fantastic ETF mini series. We've got the playlist on YouTube and on Spotify, so you can have a listen to that. And that steps through everything from opening the brokerage account, understanding what ETFs are, how to pick one, because there's a lot available now, and then how to invest in that chosen ETF.
Absolutely, Kate. And I think the next question is, well, what can I actually get?
All right. So let's say I would love an extra $40,000 a year. Maybe that's so I can work part-time, I can take a sabbatical, I can just be a little bit more relaxed with my lifestyle. What would I need to invest to have that rolling into my bank account each year?
The way I think about this, Kate, is you don't just want the income. You also want to know if you pull the income out, that you've still got money left in there. So we go back to that example of a mistake that people make is they want to take too much out in one go. Like the cafe example. If you took too much out in one go, you wouldn't have anything left tomorrow. So what we try and target as a kind of general gist is about a 4% return in income and growth on top. So if you think about the historical return of the share market, let's call it 9% a year, you want to be able to draw that 4% out and know that it's still going to grow up 4 or 5% in the background. So even if you pull some out, you've still got some left next year. So let's do some basic maths. If you have $100,000 invested and you're getting a 4% return, that's $4,000. So if you have $1 million, like say you're ready for retirement, you've saved really well, you're ready for retirement, that would be $40,000 a year. Now, it's important to understand that there is a little bit of give and take here. Let's say you wanted $40,000, but you didn't have $1 million. Or you could increase the amount that you have in what we call the yield, or the amount of income that you get. But you've got to remember that it may not grow as fast. So we can't just click our fingers and have money appear out of thin air. But what we can do is we do have a little bit of a lever that we can pull up or down to get a little bit more income. And a good example is something that you alluded to, which probably not a lot of people picked up on, which is that you may not necessarily need $100,000 or $50,000 or even $40,000. You may only need $20,000, and that's enough to cover your rent or a bit of your mortgage. And that gives you the freedom to then go and take a new job that doesn't pay you as much, or it's maybe only 3 days a week. And that's enough passive income to give you the freedom that you so badly want. So a lot of people think that they need to get to this stage where I've got $1 million. I can do whatever I want for forever. No, what you'll find is that on the journey to that bigger amount of money, you have more and more freedom. So this is something that a lot of the people in the financial independence community talk about. Realistically, if you're in debt and you've got credit cards or you've got buy now, pay later type loans, you're not going to feel very secure with your money. You're going to stay in a job you don't love. You might live in an area you don't really like, those types of things. But now imagine that you've got none of those loans and you've got $50,000. So we're not earning huge passive income, but what we've got is a lot more freedom. And now you go, I could get to $100,000. And now you're earning $4,000, $200,000, $8,000, $300,000, $12,000. And you start to build up to it quicker than you expect. But on that journey, you're getting more and more freedom. So what we say, and you say this a lot, is the early days, it's just about shoveling money away. It's about getting money in there and putting it in there so that you can get that 4 or 5% return in income plus growth. Remember, it's still growing. You're getting that in the background until a point where you're like, I feel pretty good about this. It's now growing faster. Then I'm adding money and it becomes this snowball that just keeps rolling and keep rolling. Now, the good news is here in Australia is we do have forced savings. So if you heard me say $1 million, like, oh, that's a lot of money. Realistically, if you think about it, each and every month or each and every paycheck, Australia is saving around about 10%. It's going up over time, but it's around about that figure. That means that all of us are long-term investors, and when we retire, we will have some passive income no matter what. But in the meantime, we can keep shoveling extra money away and keep that snowball building. And what you'll find is that a lot of us, as long as we have decent jobs, we have a good savings habit, we're going to be earning really good passive income before we know it.
Yeah. And for me, my dividends have acted as a really good buffer this year. While I've been working part-time, they've helped me still work towards my various savings goals or travel plans over Christmas because I've had a little bit of extra money coming in from the investments I've built over the last decade that I've been able to supplement my living costs even when I've been working reduced hours. I don't know about you, Owen.
Yeah, absolutely. So passive income is incredible and you can earn it in multiple ways. As I said, it's not just through the dividends. It can be through a property investment if you've got enough money. It could be through a business. Maybe you sell an online course or you have something like that you've built before and it's just kind of running free now. There are so many ways that you can earn passive income. And for me, it's the biggest driver for me and it's what I want to earn continuously. I want to just hammer home that the key point is you're not going to get to this overnight. It will require work. Every extra little bit that you can save is going to help you. We mentioned micro investing accounts and brokerage accounts. We mentioned ETFs and shares. One of the things that people fall into is analysis paralysis at the start. So many choices. Just do a little bit of everything. Like you say this all the time, little bits, lots of times is what makes a difference. Little bits, lots of times. So maybe that's $10 a week. Maybe it's $15 a fortnight for your kids. Whatever the case may be. And if you're stuck and you're thinking, I don't know how to get started, we have free courses. We have guides on our website that will tell you which brokerage accounts you can use, which micro investing accounts you can use, all of those things. There are so many good resources out there to get you started. And most of the good resources are free. So you don't need to go pay anyone for any really sophisticated thing you don't understand. It's really easy to get started as an investor. And while you're building up the passive income, just treat it like your Netflix subscription. Treat it like whatever your grocery shopping. You just pay the bill. Some you got to pay every month, but it's for the long-term benefit.
I think the number one thing I want people to take away is that we love investing in income producing assets, but we don't want to be just picking what we invest in, whether it's a property, a share, an ETF, or something else, just based on the number that says this investment is going to give you 10% dividend yield. We want to be looking at what actually is this investment? Is it something I want to be invested in long term? Do I understand the company, the ETF, how the property works?
Yeah. If you're watching on YouTube, particular shout out, we have a separate playlist, the ETF investing series that we did. It is by far our most popular. It explains ETFs end to end, as well as all the different types of ETFs that you could buy. And what you'll discover in that very short series is the different kind of building blocks that go in. It's not just property. It's not just shares. It's not just this or just that. It's a bit of everything. And through that, you'll begin to discover that it's a slow moving beast, but once it gets moving, it starts moving really fast and the flywheel starts to spin faster and faster and faster.
Wonderful. Well, I think that was a really good overview of everything. We have plenty of resources that we'll share with you depending on where you're watching. And I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Australian Finance Podcast.
Thanks for listening and watching. Thanks for watching this video on the Rask Network. While you're here, don't forget to like and subscribe so you can get videos each and every day on business, finance, investing, and so much more.